The town of Dustwater sat on the edge of nowhere, a collection of weathered buildings huddled against the Nevada desert like cattle against a storm. Red dust coated everything: the warped boardwalks, the canvas-covered wagons, the faces of men who'd given up on finding anything better. It was the kind of place where hope came to die. And on this October afternoon in 1885, even the buzzards circling overhead seemed to know it. Clara stood on the makeshift platform in the center of town, her wrists bound with rough rope that had already rubbed her skin raw. The auctioneer, a greasy man named Josiah Wickham, mopped his brow with a yellowed handkerchief despite the autumn chill. The crowd of men pressed closer, their breath forming clouds in the cooling air, mixing with the smell of unwashed bodies and cheap whiskey. "Now, gentlemen," Wickham called out, his voice carrying across the square, "we come to our final offering of the day. This here's Clara, age 19. Healthy enough, knows her way around a cook stove and washboard. She's a bit scrawny, I'll grant you, but she's got all her teeth and no signs of the pox." Clara kept her eyes fixed on the horizon, where the mountains rose like broken teeth against the pale sky. She'd learned in the past weeks that looking at nothing was safer than meeting anyone's gaze. Her dress, once blue calico, hung on her frame like a flour sack, stained with the dust of too many miles and the memory of better days. "Let's start the bidding at $20, Wickham announced. $20 for a wife who'll keep your house and warm your bed through the winter." Silence stretched across the square. A tumbleweed rolled past the platform, and somewhere a dog barked. The men shuffled their feet, looked at each other, looked away. $20 was 2 weeks' wages for most of them, and Clara, well, she wasn't much to look at. Too thin, too quiet, with dark circles under gray eyes that seemed to look through a man rather than at him. 15 then, Wickham tried again, his jovial tone beginning to crack. "Surely someone needs a woman about the place." A man in the front row spat tobacco juice near Clara's feet. "She looks half dead already. Wickham, you trying to sell us a corpse?" Laughter rippled through the crowd, ugly and mean. Clara's jaw tightened, but she didn't flinch. She'd heard worse in the 3 days since she'd been brought here, prodded and displayed like livestock at market. At least cattle got fed regular. $10, Wickham said, desperation creeping into his voice. The other women, a widow from Missouri, 2 saloon girls who'd gotten in trouble with the law, and a half-breed Apache girl, had all sold within the hour. But Clara was the leftover, the one nobody wanted. "Come now, boys. $10 for a legal wife, that's less than you'd spend on a good saddle." "Saddle's more useful," someone called out, and more laughter followed. Clara finally let her gaze drop to study her bare feet, blue with cold against the rough planks. She'd lost her shoes somewhere outside of Carson City, along with everything else that mattered. Her parents' wagon had been found overturned in a ravine, picked clean by scavengers. Whether they'd died in the accident or after, she didn't know. She'd waited 3 days by their graves before the benefactor had found her, a man who'd promised safe passage to California and delivered her here instead. $5? Wickham was almost pleading now. The sun was sinking lower, and he had a poker game waiting at the silver dollar. "Gentlemen, please, even if you just need someone to tend your chickens." That's when Clara saw him. He stood at the very edge of the crowd, half in shadow beneath the overhang of Murphy's General Store, tall and lean, with shoulders that spoke of hard work despite the way his left arm hung useless at his side. His face was weathered dark as old leather, with lines carved deep around eyes the color of winter sky. He wore no hat, and his brown hair, streaked early with gray, fell past his collar. Everything about him said he wanted to be anywhere but here. Their eyes met for just a moment, hers empty, his full of something she couldn't name. Then he looked away, jaw working like he was chewing on words he wouldn't speak. "No takers, then," Wickham announced with disgust. "Well, I suppose the county can—" A hand rose from the shadows, not quickly, not eagerly, but with the slow deliberation of a man lifting something heavy. "I'll take her." The voice was rough as sandpaper, unused to speaking. Every head turned to stare at the man who stepped forward into the dying light. Elias Thornton, that's what they called him, though few had ever heard him speak his own name. He'd been in Dustwater for 3 years, living alone in a cabin up in the hills, coming to town only for supplies and whiskey. The story went that he'd lost his family to raiders, but stories in Dustwater were worth about as much as Confederate money. Well, Wickham's face lit up like Christmas morning. "Mr. Thornton, I didn't know you were in the market for a wife." Elias didn't answer. He reached into his coat with his good hand and pulled out a leather pouch, counting out $5 silver onto the platform. The coins clinked against the wood, each sound sharp in the sudden quiet. "Sold," Wickham announced quickly, before anyone could think too hard about what was happening. "Come on down, girl. You belong to Mr. Thornton now." Clara's legs nearly gave out as she stepped off the platform. The rope around her wrists was cut, and she rubbed the raw skin, trying to get feeling back into her fingers. Elias had already turned away, walking toward a paint horse tied to the hitching post. He didn't look back to see if she followed. She had nowhere else to go. The crowd parted as she hurried after him, their whispers following like dust devils. Why'd he want that one? Man must be lonelier than we thought. Probably kill her and bury her up in them hills. Elias swung up into the saddle with practiced ease, despite his useless arm. For a moment, Clara stood beside the horse, uncertain. Then he shifted forward slightly and held out his good hand. His palm was calloused hard as horn, but his grip was careful as he pulled her up behind him. "Hold on," he said, the second and last words he'd speak for miles. Clara wrapped her arms around his waist, feeling the lean muscle beneath his coat, smelling leather and tobacco and something else, sage, maybe, or juniper. The horse moved smooth as water beneath them, heading west out of town as the last light bled from the sky. Behind them, Dustwater's lanterns began to flicker on, pinpricks of yellow against the gathering dark. Ahead, the road wound up into the hills, where the first stars were already showing. Clara didn't look back. There was nothing there for her anyway. The ride seemed endless. Her legs, bare beneath her thin dress, quickly went numb from cold and the strain of staying on the horse. Elias rode like he was part of the animal, adjusting to every shift and stumble on the rocky trail. Sometimes Clara could hear him breathing, slow and steady, and it was the only sound besides the horse's hooves and the wind singing through the canyons. The moon had risen full and bright by the time they reached the cabin. It squatted against a hillside like it had grown there, built from logs gone silver with age. A corral held 2 horses that whickered softly at their approach. Smoke drifted from the chimney, which meant he'd left a fire banked before heading to town. Elias dismounted and reached up to help her down. This time, Clara's legs did give out, and he caught her with his good arm, holding her steady until she found her balance. He smelled of wood smoke and whiskey, and for just a moment, she let herself lean against his solid warmth. Then he stepped back, already moving to tend the horse. Clara stood shivering in the moonlight, arms wrapped around herself, watching as he worked with quiet efficiency. Everything had its place: saddle on the rail, bridle on its peg, horse turned loose in the corral with grain and water. Finally, he headed for the cabin, pausing at the door to look back at her. In the moonlight, she could see his face more clearly. He might have been handsome once, before whatever had carved those lines around his eyes and mouth. Now he just looked tired. "Come on then," he said, and pushed open the door. The cabin was one room, but a large one. A stone fireplace took up most of one wall, with a cook stove beside it, a table with 2 chairs, a shelf of books that surprised her, and in the corner, a proper bed with a quilt that looked hand-sewn. Everything was clean, ordered, speaking of a man who lived careful and alone. Elias stirred the fire back to life and added wood. The warmth hit Clara like a physical thing, and she swayed on her feet. He glanced at her, then moved to a trunk at the foot of the bed. He pulled out a shirt and a pair of pants, tossing them on the table. "These'll be too big, but they're clean. There's water in the pitcher for washing." He grabbed a blanket from the bed and headed back outside before Clara could form words to answer. Through the window, she watched him spread the blanket on the porch boards, settling down with his back against the wall. Clara stood alone in the warm cabin, surrounded by a stranger's life, slowly, carefully, like she might spook and run. She moved to the pitcher and poured water into the basin. Her reflection in the water showed a face she barely recognized. Hollow cheeks, tangled hair, eyes like bruises. She washed as best she could, changed into the clothes that smelled of lye soap and cedar. The shirt fell to her knees. The pants had to be rolled up several times, but they were clean and warm and hers, at least for now. The bed called to her, but it felt wrong somehow. Instead, she took a blanket from the trunk and curled up on the floor near the fire. Through the thin walls, she could hear Elias shift occasionally on the porch, standing guard or giving her space. She wasn't sure which. Clara closed her eyes and tried not to think about tomorrow, about what this silent man might want from her, about what her life had become. The fire crackled softly, and somewhere in the hills, a coyote sang to the moon. She'd been sold like cattle, bought by a broken man who wouldn't even sleep in his own house because of her. But she was alive, fed, warm. For now, in this moment between her old life and whatever came next, it was enough. Sleep took her as the fire burned low, and she didn't dream at all. The first weeks passed in silence thick as morning fog. Clara learned the rhythms of the cabin like a song with no words. The creak of the floorboards where Elias stepped each morning, the whistle of wind through the chimney cracks, the way the coffee pot sang just before it boiled over. She moved through the days like a ghost, cooking, cleaning, mending, always careful not to disturb the careful order of his things. Elias left before dawn most days, returning with rabbits or prairie chickens, sometimes a deer haunch that would keep them fed for a week. He cleaned his kills outside, worked leather in the evenings, fixed what needed fixing. They ate across from each other at the small table. The only sounds the scrape of spoons against tin plates and the pop of pine logs in the fireplace. He never touched her, never asked anything beyond what she offered. Meals on time, clothes mended, the cabin kept neat. At night, he still slept outside when the weather allowed, or on the floor by the fire when rain or snow drove him in. Clara kept to the bed, though guilt gnawed at her every time she pulled up that hand-sewn quilt. The landscape around them was beautiful in its desolation. Mountains rose sharp and black against skies that shifted from pearl to rose to deep purple. The valley below was all sage and scattered juniper, cut through with dry washes that would run wild come spring. Wind was the only constant, carrying the smell of distant rain, the cry of hawks, the loneliness that seeped into everything. Clara had never known such silence. Back home in Ohio, there had always been voices, her mother singing while she worked, her father telling stories by the fire, neighbors calling across fence lines. Here, days could pass with no human sound but their own breathing. Sometimes she caught herself humming just to break the quiet, then stopped when she saw how Elias's shoulders tensed at the sound. She learned him in pieces, the way you might learn a new language, the way his jaw tightened when his bad arm pained him, how he favored his right side mounting a horse, the careful way he counted out coins at Murphy's store on their monthly supply run, buying only what they needed and nothing more. He drank whiskey some evenings, but never enough to show it. Just a single glass nursed slow while he stared into the fire. Her past lived in her like a wound that wouldn't heal. At night, she dreamed of her parents, her mother's hands braiding her hair, her father's laugh when she'd correctly name a constellation. She'd wake with tears on her cheeks, biting her knuckle to keep from crying out. They'd been good people, full of dreams about California's green valleys and new beginnings. Instead, they'd found a ravine and ravens. The man who'd rescued her had seemed kind at first, Samuel Hutchins, he'd called himself, though she doubted now that was his real name. He'd found her half dead by her parents' grave, given her water and hardtack, promised to take her to Sacramento where she could find work or family. Instead, He'd driven the wagon straight to Dustwater, collecting his finder's fee from Wickham before Clara even understood what was happening. "Don't take it personal, girl," he'd said as they'd locked her in the holding pen with the other women. "This is just business. You'll thank me someday. Better a wife than a corpse in the desert." But Clara couldn't forget the weight of her mother's silver locket in her pocket, the one Hutchins had taken while she slept, or her father's watch, or the quilt her grandmother had made. Everything that might have fetched a price. Gone into his pockets while he'd smiled and called her dear girl and promised safety. Now she was here, in this cabin that smelled of leather and loneliness, owned by a man who'd bought her for $5 silver and seemed to regret it every day since. The morning it changed was like any other. Gray dawn light seeping through the windows, frost on the glass, her breath clouding as she rose to start the fire. But when she reached for the kindling, her hand caught on a splinter from the wood box, driving deep into her palm. She gasped, jerking back, blood already welling dark against her skin. "Let me see." She hadn't heard him rise, but suddenly Elias was there, taking her hand in his good one. His fingers were gentle as he turned her palm to the light, studying the wound. The splinter was lodged deep, blood running down her wrist. "Sit," he said, guiding her to a chair. He fetched his saddlebag, pulling out a small leather kit. Inside were needles, thread, a sharp knife, strips of clean cloth, the tools of a man who'd learned to tend his own wounds. Clara watched his face as he worked, the concentration that drew his brows together, the careful way he held the knife, this close. She could see things she'd missed, a thin scar through his right eyebrow, the way his hair curled slightly at his temples, how his useless left hand wasn't completely useless, able to hold things steady while the right did the delicate work. "This'll hurt," he warned, then pulled the splinter free in one quick motion. Clara bit her lip but didn't cry out. He cleaned the wound with whiskey, wrapped it neat and tight with cloth. His thumb brushed her wrist as he tied off the bandage, and something electric passed between them. Quick as lightning. They both pulled back at the same moment, Elias already turning away, packing up his kit. But Clara had seen something in his eyes in that instant. Not pity or ownership, but recognition. The look of one wounded creature seeing another. "Thank you," she said, the first words she'd spoken directly to him in weeks. He nodded once and escaped outside, though the sun wasn't up yet and the cold would bite through his coat. Clara sat at the table, cradling her bandaged hand, feeling the ghost of his touch on her skin. After that morning, things shifted like snow beginning to thaw. Elias still kept his distance, but sometimes she'd catch him watching her, when she needed bread, when she hung laundry on the line, when she sat by the fire mending his shirts. His gaze wasn't hungry or possessive like the men at the auction. It was puzzled, almost wondering, like she was a book in a language he couldn't quite read. He started leaving small things where she'd find them. A blue ribbon from town that appeared on her pillow, a handful of late wildflowers on the table, a small carved wooden box for her few belongings. Never given directly, never acknowledged, but there all the same. One evening, as she prepared supper, Clara began to hum without thinking, an old hymn her mother used to sing while cooking. She caught herself, stopping abruptly, but Elias spoke from his chair by the fire. "Don't stop, it's nice." So she continued, soft and uncertain at first, then with more confidence as he didn't protest. The simple melody filled the cabin, pushing back the endless silence just a little. That night, instead of sleeping outside, Elias made his bed by the fire without comment. Clara lay in the dark, listening to his breathing slowly deepen into sleep, and for the first time since she'd lost everything, she didn't feel entirely alone, but the past wasn't done with either of them. Clara heard him at night when dreams took him, thrashing, calling out names in a voice raw with grief. Mabel, most often, sometimes Rose in a smaller, broken voice that must have been a child's name. He'd wake gasping, stumble outside no matter the weather, and she'd hear him pacing until dawn. She wanted to go to him, to offer some comfort, but didn't know how. What did you say to a man haunted by ghosts you couldn't see? How did you ease pain when your own hands were so empty? So she did what she could, made his coffee stronger on the mornings after bad nights, left a plate warming when he came in late from his pacing, sang softly while she worked, filling the cabin with something besides silence and sorrow. Winter crept closer, turning the mornings sharp and the evenings long. They developed a routine that was almost like companionship. Elias taught her to set snares, to read the weather in cloud formations, to tell time by the stars. Clara showed him how to bake bread that didn't break teeth, how to patch clothes so the mending didn't show, how to brew tea from the wild herbs that grew near the creek. They still barely spoke, but the silence had changed quality. It was no longer the thick, suffocating quiet of strangers, but something more companionable. Sometimes, sitting by the fire in the evening, him carving, her sewing, it almost felt like peace. Then came the night Clara woke to find him standing over her bed, eyes wild and unseeing, caught in some nightmare. In the moonlight, tears tracked silver down his cheeks as he reached out with his good hand, touching empty air. "Mabel?" he whispered. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I couldn't stop them." Clara's heart broke at the anguish in his voice. Without thinking, she sat up and caught his searching hand in both of hers. "She's gone," she said gently. "I'm sorry, but she's gone. You're here. You're safe." He blinked, awareness flooding back into his eyes. For a moment, he stood frozen, his hand still clasped in hers. Then he pulled away like he'd been burned, stumbling backward. Forgive me. I didn't mean—" He turned and fled into the night, leaving the door swinging open behind him. Clara found him at dawn, sitting by the small crosses on the hillside above the cabin. 2 graves, one larger, one heartbreakingly small. The wooden markers were weathered but carefully maintained, wildflowers placed regularly despite the season. She approached slowly, like she would a spooked horse. When she settled beside him on the cold ground, he didn't pull away. "My wife," he said finally, voice rough. "And my daughter, Rose. She was only 6. Clara waited, knowing there was more. The sun climbed higher, painting the valley gold and shadow. "Raiders hit us 3 years back. I was in town for supplies. Came home to—" He stopped, jaw working. "I should have been there. Should have died with them. Instead, I got there in time to bury them and track down 3 of the men who did it." His useless arm moved slightly, and Clara understood. He'd gotten his revenge, but at a cost. The last one got away. Probably dead by now anyway. Doesn't matter. Nothing I did brought them back. They sat in silence as the day warmed around them. Finally, Clara spoke. "My parents died 2 months ago. Wagon went off the trail in a storm. I don't even know if it was an accident or if someone... I waited by their graves until I couldn't wait anymore. Then Hutchins found me, and I thought..." She laughed bitterly. "I thought I was saved." Elias turned to look at her then, really look at her. "How old are you?" 19, 20 come spring." "Christ," he rubbed his face with his good hand. "You're just a child." "I'm not a child." The words came out fiercer than she intended. "Children don't bury their parents alone. Children don't get sold like cattle. I'm not a child anymore." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "No, I suppose you're not." They made their way back to the cabin as full morning arrived. Something had shifted between them on that hillside. Some understanding reached without words. They were 2 souls wrecked by loss, thrown together by cruel chance, trying to find their way through days that stretched empty and endless. That night, when Elias started to make his pallet by the fire, Clara spoke up. "The bed's big enough for 2, and winter's coming. Makes no sense for you to sleep cold." He hesitated, and she could see the war in his face, but practicality won out. He nodded once and climbed carefully into the far side of the bed, fully clothed, staying so close to the edge she worried he'd fall off. Clara lay in the dark, acutely aware of his presence, the warmth of another body, the sound of his breathing. the way the mattress dipped with his weight. It had been so long since she'd felt not alone. She found herself crying silently, tears soaking into the pillow. A hand found hers in the darkness. Calloused fingers intertwined with hers, asking nothing, offering only the comfort of human connection. They fell asleep that way, hands clasped like children afraid of the dark, while outside the wind sang its lonesome song through the canyons. Winter settled over the valley like a heavy quilt, turning the world white and silent. Inside the cabin, Clara found a rhythm to her days that almost felt like contentment. She rose before dawn to start the fire, made coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe nail, the way Elias liked it, and watched the sunrise paint the snow-covered peaks pink and gold. The small tasks that had once felt like servitude became acts of quiet satisfaction. There was something deeply comforting about kneading bread dough while snow fell outside, about patching a torn shirt by lamplight, about filling the cabin with the smell of rabbit stew and sage. These were things her mother had done, and her grandmother before her, women building homes out of whatever wilderness they found themselves in. Elias had changed too, in ways subtle but significant. He no longer fled her presence like a spooked deer. Sometimes she'd catch him almost smiling when she hummed over her work. He'd begun teaching her things without being asked: how to oil leather to keep it supple, how to read tomorrow's weather in today's sunset, how to shoot his old Henry rifle in case trouble came while he was gone. "Squeeze gentle-like," he'd said, standing behind her as she aimed at a tin can balanced on a fence post. "It's not a fight. More like you're calling it home." The rifle kicked against her shoulder. The can went flying, and Elias had actually grinned. Just for a moment. But she'd seen it, the man he might have been before grief carved out his insides. They still shared the bed with careful distance between them. But sometimes Clara would wake to find they'd drifted together in sleep, her back against his chest, his good arm draped protective over her waist. They'd separate quickly come morning, neither acknowledging the comfort they'd taken in the darkness. The trip to town in late November tested their fragile peace. Elias needed supplies they couldn't make or hunt: flour, salt, ammunition. Clara had mended and remended her single dress until there was more patch than original fabric. They hitched the wagon early, on a day when the sky promised to hold clear, and made the slow journey down from the hills. Dustwater looked even more dismal under a coating of dirty snow. The same men lounged outside the saloon. The same women hurried past with downcast eyes. The same feeling of desperation hung in the air like smoke. But now Clara saw it from the outside, no longer one of the desperate ones. She had a home, however humble. She had enough to eat. She had Elias, whatever that meant. At Murphy's General Store, she fingered bolts of fabric while Elias discussed prices with old Murphy. The storekeeper's wife, Ada Murphy, sidled up to Clara with the predatory friendliness of a woman hungry for gossip. "Well now, aren't you looking better fed?" Ada said, eyes taking in every detail of Clara's appearance. We all wondered what Thornton wanted with a bride auction girl, him being so particular about keeping to himself. Clara said nothing, concentrating on a bolt of blue calico that reminded her of her mother's church dress. "Of course, we knew his first wife," Ada continued, voice dropping to a confidential whisper. "Mabel was quality folk, from a good family back east. Proper lady. Not like—" She gestured vaguely at Clara. "Well, I suppose a man takes what comfort he can find." The words stung like wasps, but Clara had learned to school her face into blankness. She turned away from the fabric and moved toward the door, needing air. That's when she saw him. A man leaning against a post outside the saloon, watching her with interest that made her skin crawl. Rough-dressed, unshaven, with pale eyes that seemed to strip her bare. When he smiled, showing tobacco-stained teeth, her stomach turned to ice. Well, if it ain't the leftover bride." He pushed off from the post, moving closer. "Remember me, darling? Jake Fowler. I was at your auction. Would have bid on you myself. But hell, I can get female company for less than $5. Clara backed away, but he followed, backing her against the storefront window. "Course, Maybe I should have taken the chance. Thornton's had you broke in by now. I reckon might be worth something after all." The man's words cut off in a gurgle as Elias's hand closed around his throat, slamming him back against the wall. Clara had never seen Elias move so fast, hadn't heard him exit the store. His face was carved from stone, but his eyes burned with a fury that transformed him. "Touch her," Elias said, voice deadly quiet. "Speak to her. Look at her again, and I'll kill you. Slow, understand?" Fowler's face was turning purple, his hands clawing at Elias's grip. Other men had gathered, watching with the bright interest of those hoping for bloodshed. Finally, Elias released him. Fowler dropped to his knees, gasping. "Crazy bastard," he wheezed. "She ain't worth—" Elias's boot caught him in the ribs, sending him sprawling in the muddy snow. Then Elias turned, took Clara's arm, gentle as you please, and guided her to their wagon. The crowd parted before them like water. They rode in silence until Dustwater disappeared behind them. Then Elias pulled the wagon to a stop, his hands shaking slightly on the reins. "Did he hurt you?" "No." Clara's own voice surprised her, steady when she felt anything but. "No, he just talked. Men like that—" Elias stared straight ahead, jaw working. "I should have killed him. I'm glad you didn't." She meant it. She'd seen enough death. "I'm not worth hanging for." He turned to look at her then, something fierce in his expression. "Don't say that. Don't ever say that." They looked at each other for a long moment, something crackling in the air between them like lightning fixing to strike. Then Elias clicked to the horses and they continued home, but Clara felt the weight of his gaze on her all the way up the mountain. That night, the storm that had been building all day finally broke. Rain lashed the cabin, driven horizontal by wind that found every crack and crevice. The temperature dropped so fast that ice formed on the inside of the windows. They piled every blanket on the bed, built the fire high, but still the cold crept in like a living thing. Clara woke shivering so hard her teeth chattered. The fire had died to embers, and frost sparkled on the quilt where their breath had frozen. Without thinking, she pressed closer to Elias, seeking his warmth. He woke with a start, automatically pulling her against him. "Christ, you're frozen." His hand rubbed her back, trying to warm her through the thin nightgown. Clara pressed her face against his chest, breathing in his warmth. His scent. Safe. For the first time in so long, she felt safe. "Clara." Her name came out rough, almost pained. She lifted her head to look at him. In the dim light, his face was all plains and shadows, but his eyes were bright. Slowly, giving her time to pull away, he brought his hand up to cup her cheek. His thumb traced her cheekbone. "A touch light as snowfall. I'm no good for you," he whispered. "Broken down, used up. You deserve better than what I can give." "I don't want better." The words came from somewhere deep, somewhere true. "I just want you." He made a sound like something tearing inside him. Then his mouth found hers, and the world outside ceased to matter. The kiss was careful at first, almost reverent. His lips were chapped from the cold, but gentle, learning the shape of her. Clara had never been kissed before, not with meaning, not with want behind it. She understood instinctively that this was different from whatever crude thing men like Fowler imagined. This was question and answer, give and take, two wounded souls recognizing each other in the darkness. When they broke apart, both breathing unsteadily. Elias rested his forehead against hers. "I haven't, not since Mabel. I don't know if I remember how to be gentle." Clara took his face in her hands, feeling the roughness of stubble, the wetness on his cheeks that might have been tears. "Then we'll learn together." They came together again, slower this time, hands tentative but growing bolder. Elias traced the line of her spine through her nightgown, making her shiver for reasons that had nothing to do with cold. Clara's fingers found the buttons of his shirt, undoing them one by one until she could feel the warm skin beneath, the steady beat of his heart. "You sure?" he asked, pulling back to search her face. Instead of answering with words, she pulled her nightgown over her head. baring herself to him completely. The cold bit at her skin, but his gaze was warm enough to burn. God Almighty, he breathed. You're beautiful. No one had ever called her beautiful before. Pretty, maybe, before hardship had carved her down to sharp edges. But the way Elias looked at her, like she was water in the desert, like she was sunrise after endless night, made her believe it might be true. They made love slowly, carefully, with a storm raging outside and the world shrunk down to just this bed, just their two bodies learning each other. Elias was patient despite the trembling in his limbs, letting her set the pace, watching her face for any sign of discomfort. When they finally joined, Clara gasped at the foreignness of it, the strange sweet ache of being filled. Am I hurting you? Elias went still, concern creasing his brow. No. She pulled him down for a kiss, tasting salt and need. No, it's just different. Good different. They moved together awkwardly at first, finding rhythm, finding what pleased. Clara had expected pain. The other women at the auction house had whispered about wedding nights with horror in their voices. But there was only stretching, adjusting, and then something else. Something that built like a storm in her belly, tightening and spreading until she cried out, clutching at Elias's shoulders. He followed her over that edge with a sound like breaking, burying his face in her neck as shudders racked his body. Afterward, they lay tangled together, sweat cooling on their skin despite the cold. Clara could feel his heart racing against her chest, matching the wild beat of her own. You all right? Elias asked, pressing a kiss to her temple. Yes. She was surprised to find it was true, more than all right. For the first time since her world had ended, she felt alive. Are you? He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Then, I didn't think I'd ever feel anything again besides anger and whiskey. But you. He pulled her closer, his voice rough with emotion. You make me want to try. They stayed awake as the storm spent itself, talking in whispers. Elias told her about meeting Mabel at a church social, how she'd laughed at his clumsy attempts at courting, how Rose had been born during a blizzard worse than this one, coming into the world squalling and perfect, how he'd built this cabin with his own hands, back when both arms worked proper. Clara shared her own memories, her parents' love story, her father's dreams of California gold, her mother's garden back in Ohio that bloomed with every color the good Lord made. She talked until her throat was raw, pouring out all the words she'd held inside for months. When dawn came, pale and washed clean by the storm, they were still entwined. The fire had died completely, and ice crystals glittered on every surface, but neither wanted to move. This moment felt fragile as spun glass, like any sudden movement might shatter it. No going back now, Elias said softly. I don't want to go back. Clara traced the scar that ran across his ribs. Another story written in flesh. Do you? No. He caught her hand, bringing it to his lips. No, I reckon I don't. Outside, the world was transformed under a coating of ice that caught the early light like diamonds. Everything sparkled and shimmered, beautiful and treacherous at once. But inside the cabin, wrapped in each other and the tattered quilts, Clara and Elias had found something worth the risk of breaking. A chance at healing, at home, at love growing wild in the most unlikely ground. The sun climbed higher, and eventually the demands of the day pulled them from bed. But something fundamental had shifted in the night. The careful distance was gone, replaced by casual touches, his hand on her waist as he passed, her fingers brushing his as she handed him coffee. They moved around each other like dancers who'd finally learned the steps. Clara hummed as she made breakfast, and this time Elias hummed along. Spring came slow to the mountains, fighting winter for every inch of ground. The snow retreated grudgingly, revealing the brown grass beneath, and the creek began to sing again as ice gave way to rushing water. Inside the cabin, a different kind of thaw had taken hold. Clara woke most mornings to find Elias already watching her, his eyes soft in the early light. They'd given up any pretense of sleeping apart, fitting together each night like two halves of something broken made whole. His nightmares came less frequently now. And when they did, Clara was there to call him back from whatever dark place his mind wandered. "Morning," he'd say, voice rough with sleep, and kiss her like he still couldn't quite believe she was real. "Morning yourself," she'd answer, stretching against him like a cat in sunshine. They'd make love slow and easy as the day broke around them, learning each other's rhythms, mapping scars and secrets with hands and mouths. Clara discovered she was bolder than she'd imagined, delighting in the sounds she could draw from Elias, the way his controls shattered when she touched him just so. He showed her pleasure she hadn't known existed, patient and thorough, until she understood why married women back home had smiled those secret smiles. The work of survival continued, but now it felt like building something together rather than merely enduring. Elias taught Clara to gentle the new colt he'd caught wild in the canyons. Clara showed him how to coax vegetables from the stubborn mountain soil. They worked side by side through the lengthening days, comfortable in shared silence or easy conversation. One afternoon, as Clara hung laundry on the line, she heard Elias laughing. The sound stopped her cold. She'd never heard him truly laugh before. She found him by the chicken coop, watching their rooster chase a ground squirrel with outraged dignity. When he saw her staring, he actually blushed. "Fool bird thinks he's a wolf," he said, but he was still grinning. "I like it." Clara said, "The laughing. I mean, you should do it more." He pulled her close, kissing her temple. "You make a lot of things easier. Clara Rose." The name slipped out without thought, and they both froze. Rose, his daughter's name. Clara felt him tense, saw the shadow creep back into his eyes. "I'm sorry," he started, but she pressed her fingers to his lips. "Don't be. She was part of you. That means she's part of us now, too." He buried his face in her hair, holding her tight enough to hurt. "How'd I get so lucky? Finding you?" "Wasn't luck," Clara said. "Was $5 silver." That startled another laugh out of him, and the moment passed, but she treasured it. That small sign that maybe the ghosts were making room for the living. As spring deepened, they ventured out more. Elias showed her hidden valleys where wildflowers carpeted the ground in purple and gold. They picnicked by pools where snowmelt gathered clear as glass. He carved her a whistle from a willow branch, and she played simple tunes while he fished for trout. One day, he surprised her with a dress length of the blue calico she'd admired at Murphy's. "When did you get this?" she asked, running her hands over the soft fabric. "Had Murphy set it aside that day? Figured you needed something pretty." Clara kissed him soundly, then set about cutting and sewing with a happiness that made her fingers fly. The first time she wore the finished dress, Elias looked at her like she'd hung the moon. "You're a picture," he said, spinning her around the cabin. "Prettiest thing these mountains ever saw." They danced without music, just the two of them swaying while beans bubbled on the stove and the evening sun slanted gold through the windows. It was a perfect moment, crystallized in time, which is why Clara shouldn't have been surprised when it shattered. The riders came at dusk 3 days later. Elias saw them first, his body going rigid as he stood from splitting wood. "Get inside," he said, voice flat and hard as flint. "Get the rifle." Clara didn't argue. She knew that tone, had heard it the day he'd confronted Fowler in town. Inside. She loaded the Henry with trembling fingers, checked the load on the shotgun too. Through the window, she watched 3 men approach on horseback, spreading out in that careful way of those looking for trouble. The one in the lead she recognized with a sick lurch of her stomach. Samuel Hutchins, the man who'd rescued her and sold her to Wickham. He looked prosperous. New coat, silver on his saddle, the satisfied air of a man who'd been eating well. "Evening, Thornton," Hutchins called, reining up just outside of rifle range. "Nice little place you got here. State your business and get gone." Elias stood relaxed, but Clara could see the tension coiled in him like a spring. "Now, that's not very neighborly," Hutchins smiled. All teeth and no warmth. "See, I'm here on a matter of property. Seems you've got something that belongs to me. Nothing here belongs to you." "Well now, that's where we disagree." Hutchins shifted in his saddle. hand resting casual-like near his pistol. See, I invested time and resources in acquiring a certain piece of merchandise. Young woman, about yay high, probably looking a sight better fed than when you bought her. Ring any bells? Clara's hands tightened on the rifle. Through the window, she saw Elias take a step forward. I paid Wickham fair and square. She's my wife now. Legal and proper. You've got no claim. Wife, Hutchins laughed, ugly and knowing. That what you're calling it? Well, here's the thing. Thornton, the girl was already spoken for when your man Wickham jumped the gun. I had a buyer lined up in Carson City, willing to pay considerable more than your $5. The way I see it, you owe me the difference. The way I see it, Elias said, slow and dangerous. You've got about 10 seconds to turn those horses around. The other two riders, rough men with the look of those who do anything for coin, spread wider, hands drifting to weapons. Clara made a decision. She stepped out onto the porch, rifle held steady. Nobody's owed anything, she said, proud when her voice didn't shake. You told me you were taking me to Sacramento. Hutchins, you lied, took everything my parents left me, and sold me like livestock. Whatever claim you think you have, it's built on lies and theft. Hutchins' face darkened. Now, girl, you don't want to go speaking out of turn. These are dangerous men I'm riding with. Wouldn't want anyone getting hurt over a misunderstanding. Only misunderstanding, Elias said, is you thinking you'll leave here breathing if you don't ride on. Now. For a moment, the world balanced on a knife's edge. Clara could see Hutchins calculating 3 guns against 2, but Elias had cover in the high ground. Plus, men like Hutchins preferred easier prey. Finally, he smiled that snake smile again. This ain't over, Thornton. Man can't watch his back every minute. Accidents happen in these mountains. Fires start, stock goes missing. Women find themselves alone and unprotected. Try it, Elias said simply. They stared at each other for another long moment. Then Hutchins wheeled his horse around, the other two following. But just before they crested the ridge, he called back, Enjoy her while you can. Thornton, everything you love has a way of dying on you. Don't it? The words hit like a physical blow. Clara saw Elias flinch, saw his hand tremble where it hung by his side. She wanted to go to him, but he stood frozen until the riders were out of sight. Then he turned and walked past her into the cabin without a word. She found him sitting on the bed, head in his hands. When she touched his shoulder, he jerked away. He's right, Elias said, voice hollow. Everything I touch turns to ash. Mabel, Rose, and now I've put you in danger too. Stop that. Clara knelt in front of him, taking his face in her hands. You didn't kill your family. Raiders did, and you didn't put me in danger. Hutchins did that when he stole me from my parents' grave. You could leave. The words came out cracked and desperate. Take the horse. Go to California like your folks wanted. Start fresh where nobody knows. She kissed him hard, swallowing whatever foolishness he was about to say. When she pulled back, his eyes were wet. I'm not going anywhere, she said fierce. You're stuck with me, Elias Thornton. For better or worse, remember? That's what marriage means. We're not really married. He said, No preacher, no papers, just a bill of sale from Wickham. Then we'll fix that. Clara said, Soon as we can. But papers or no papers, I'm your wife and you're my husband. That's the truth of it. He pulled her against him then, holding on like she might disappear. They stayed that way until full dark, drawing strength from each other. That night, they made love with a desperate edge, hands clutching, bodies pressed close as breath would allow. Afterward, Elias traced her face in the darkness like he was memorizing it by touch. If something happens to me, he started. Nothing's going to happen. Clara, listen. If something happens, there's money hidden under the floorboard by the stove. Enough to get you somewhere safe. Promise me you'll use it. She wanted to argue, but the pleading in his voice stopped her. I promise, but only if you promise to fight like hell to make sure I never need it. Always, he said, and sealed it with a kiss. They set about preparing for trouble with grim efficiency. Elias taught Clara to load and shoot on the run, to read signs of approach in birdsong and wind shift. They stored water and food in case of siege, cached weapons around the property, set up watch schedules. The easy peace of spring gave way to watchful tension. But days passed, then weeks, with no sign of Hutchins or his men. Slowly, carefully, they began to relax. Maybe it had been all bluster. Maybe Hutchins had found easier pickings elsewhere. Then came the night Clara woke to the smell of smoke. Fire! She shook Elias awake, both of them stumbling out to see the barn blazing against the night sky. The horses screamed in terror, and without thinking, Clara ran toward the flames. No! Elias caught her, dragging her back. It's a trap. They want us focused on the fire, as if his words had summoned them. Gunfire erupted from 3 directions. They dove for cover as bullets chewed splinters from the cabin walls. Clara's heart hammered as she crawled for the rifle, glass from the shattered window raining down. How many? She gasped. 3, maybe 4. Elias had his pistol out, returning fire. They're trying to pin us down. Wait for the fire to drive us out. The barn collapsed in a shower of sparks, taking their winter hay stores with it. The horses had broken free. Thank God. Scattering into the darkness. But the wind was pushing embers toward the cabin. We need to move, Elias said. Can't stay here. They fought their way out the back, using the smoke for cover. Clara had never been so terrified, but she forced her hands steady on the rifle, laying down covering fire while Elias led them to the rocky ground above the cabin. What followed was the longest night of her life. They played cat and mouse among the boulders, gunfire echoing off stone, the burning barn painting everything in hell's own light. Clara shot a man who tried to flank them, watching him fall with a detached sort of horror. There was no time for guilt, not with Elias bleeding from a graze across his ribs, not with Hutchins' voice carrying through the darkness, promising all manner of horrors if they'd just surrender. Dawn was breaking gray and cold when Elias finally got a clear shot at Hutchins. The man went down hard, clutching his chest, and the remaining attackers fled rather than face the light without their leader. Clara and Elias stumbled down from the rocks, exhausted, bloodied, but alive. Hutchins lay in the dust, breath rattling in his throat. When he saw them approach, he tried to smile. Should have taken my offer. Girly, he wheezed. Could have saved everybody a lot of trouble. Clara knelt beside him, surprising herself with her steady hands. The only trouble here is what you brought with you. He coughed, blood speckling his lips. You think you've won? I'm just one man. There's always more like me. Always someone willing to trade in desperate women. You'll see, this world ain't kind to the weak. No, Clara said quietly. But that's why we've got to be strong. Hutchins's eyes went glassy, fixed on something beyond the sunrise. Clara stood, turning away from the corpse to find Elias watching her with something like awe. You all right? He asked. She considered the question. She'd killed a man, watched another die, lost the barn and nearly the cabin. But she was alive, and Elias was alive, and the sun was rising on a new day. Yes, she said, and found it was true. We're all right. They buried Hutchins and his man in unmarked graves, well away from where Mabel and Rose lay. Then they set about rebuilding what had been lost. It was hard work, harder with the barn gone and supplies running low, but neighbors came, drawn by the smoke, and suddenly they weren't alone. Men who'd never given Elias more than a nod helped raise new walls. Women who'd whispered about the auction bride brought food and cloth and quiet support. Even cranky Murphy extended credit without being asked. Folks take care of their own out here, was all he said when Elias tried to thank him. Standing in their rebuilt barn as summer took hold of the mountains, Clara understood something fundamental had changed. They were no longer strangers playing at marriage, no longer two broken souls hiding from the world. They'd been tested by fire, literal and figurative, and come through stronger. That night, as they lay entwined in their bed, Elias spoke into the darkness. I love you, Clara. Don't know if I've said it proper, but I do. You brought me back to life. She pressed her face against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. I love you too, for saving me, for seeing me as more than goods to be traded, for giving me a home. We gave each other a home, he corrected, pressing a kiss to her hair. That's how love works, I reckon. Building something together that neither could manage alone. Outside, coyotes sang to the rising moon, and the night wind whispered through the pines. But inside the cabin, two souls who'd found each other against all odds held tight and dreamed of the future they'd build, one day at a time, together. The morning after the attack dawned clear and cold, revealing the full extent of the damage. Clara stood beside Elias, surveying the scorched earth where their barn had been, the bullet-scarred walls of their cabin, the churned ground that spoke of violence. But she also saw the mountains rising eternal beyond, the creek still singing its ancient song, the eagle circling high above as if nothing had changed. We'll rebuild, Elias said quietly, stronger this time. Clara took his hand, feeling the calluses and scars that told their own stories. We will. They worked through the morning, salvaging what they could, when old Ben Garrett came riding up the trail, the nearest neighbor from the valley below. He rarely made the climb to their cabin. His weathered face was grim as he dismounted. Heard the gunfire last night, he said without preamble. Saw the smoke. You folks all right? We're alive, Elias answered. Lost the barn, but we're alive. Ben's eyes took in the graves, the damage, the weary set of their shoulders. Hutchins? Won't be troubling anyone else, Clara said firmly. The old man nodded slow. Good riddance. That snake had it coming. He pulled a flask from his coat, offering it to Elias. Martha sent some supplies in the wagon. Be along directly. And Elias, there's something you should know. Hutchins weren't working alone. Word is he was part of a bigger operation, trading women from here to California. You may have more trouble coming. Elias's jaw tightened, but Clara stepped forward. Then we'll face it. We're not running. Ben studied her for a long moment, then smiled. No, I reckon you're not. Martha said you had steel in you, even if you came from the auction. Glad to see she was right. True to his word. Martha Garrett arrived within the hour, their wagon loaded with lumber, nails, and provisions. She was a stout woman with kind eyes and hands that never stopped moving. While the men discussed rebuilding plans, she drew Clara aside. How are you really, child? Clara considered lying, saying she was fine, but something in Martha's eyes invited truth. I killed a man last night. I thought it would feel different. Worse, but when it was him or Elias, there was no choice. Martha nodded, understanding in her weathered face. That's the way of it out here. We do what we must to protect what's ours. Doesn't make us monsters, just survivors. She paused, studying Clara's face. There's something else, isn't there? Clara's hand went unconsciously to her belly. She'd been ignoring the signs for weeks, the queasiness in the mornings, the tenderness in her breasts, the bone-deep exhaustion that had nothing to do with hard work. I think I might be carrying... Martha's face lit up. Oh, child, does Elias know? Not yet. With everything that's happened, I wasn't sure when to tell him. What if he thinks it's too dangerous now? What if nothing? Martha interrupted gently. That man loves you fierce. A baby will just give him more reason to fight for this life you're building. That night, after the Garretts had gone and they'd made what repairs they could, Clara found herself standing by Mabel and Rose's graves. The wooden crosses stood weathered but strong, like the man who'd placed them there. She knelt, placing a handful of wildflowers she'd gathered. I hope you don't mind, she whispered to the evening air. My being here, loving him, I promise I'll take care of him. And maybe there'll be children again in this place. Would that be all right? The wind sighed through the pines, and for a moment Clara could almost imagine it was an answer. When she turned, Elias stood watching from the cabin door, his expression unreadable in the fading light. I come up here sometimes too, he said as she approached. Less now than before. You've given me better things to think on than the past. Clara took a breath. gathering courage. "Elias, I need to tell you something." His face immediately creased with concern. "You hurt? Something from last night?" "No, nothing like that." She took his hands, placing them on her still flat belly. "I'm carrying our baby. I think about 2 months along." The emotions that crossed his face were like weather shock, fear, wonder, and finally, joy so profound it transformed him. He dropped to his knees, pressing his face against her stomach, shoulders shaking. When he looked up, tears tracked down his cheeks. "A baby," he whispered. "Our baby. Clara, are you... is it..." "I'm sure," she said, running her fingers through his hair. "And I'm scared and happy and everything all at once. I know the timing's not ideal. With Hutchins, people may be coming, but..." He stood, pulling her into a fierce embrace. "The timing's perfect, don't you see? This is what we're fighting for, not just survival, but a future, a real life." He pulled back to look at her, wonder still written across his features. "A baby. Lord help us, we're having a baby." They spent the night planning in whispers, curled together in bed while the fire burned low. Names were debated, dreams shared, fears admitted. Elias's hand never left her belly, as if he could protect their child through will alone. "I failed them before," he said into the darkness. "Mabel and Rose, I wasn't there when they needed me." "This is different," Clara assured him. "We're together, we're ready, and we know what we're facing." The next weeks passed in a blur of preparation. Word spread somehow, perhaps through Martha Garrett's gossip network, and help came from unexpected quarters. The barn rose from the ashes, stronger than before, with the neighbors contributing labor and materials. The sheriff from the county seat rode up to take statements about Hutchins, nodding grimly as he listened to their tale. "Self-defense, clear as day," he pronounced. "And between you and me, Hutchins was wanted in 3 territories. You did everyone a favor." He paused at his horse, looking back. "His associates might come sniffing around. If they do, you send word. This county protects its own." Clara's pregnancy progressed with the rebuilding. Morning sickness left her retching behind the cabin while Elias held her hair, murmuring soothing nonsense. Her body changed in ways that fascinated and frightened her by turns. Elias treated her like spun glass until she snapped at him that pregnancy wasn't an illness and she could still work. "Thank you very much." But at night, when he talked to her belly in soft whispers, telling their unborn child about the mountains and the stars and the life they'd have, Clara felt her heart might burst from loving him. One evening in late summer, as Clara struggled to let out the waist of her dress again, riders appeared on the ridge. Elias grabbed his rifle, but these weren't the rough men they'd feared. A woman rode in front, sitting straight-backed on a fine bay mare, followed by 2 armed escorts. She was perhaps 40, well-dressed, with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. "Mr. and Mrs. Thornton?" Her voice carried Eastern education and Western steel. "My name is Mrs. Catherine Morrison. I run an organization dedicated to stopping the trafficking of women in the territories. I understand you had some trouble with Samuel Hutchins." Clara and Elias exchanged glances. "He's dead," Elias said flatly. "Yes, I'm aware. And good riddance." Mrs. Morrison dismounted with surprising grace. "But he was part of a larger network. I'm here to ask for your help in stopping them." They invited her in, curiosity overcoming caution. Over coffee tea for Clara, whose stomach rebelled at coffee these days. Mrs. Morrison laid out her proposal. "You killed Hutchins, but his partners are still operating. They're more careful now, but also more desperate. I need someone who knows their methods, who can identify the women they're trying to sell." She looked directly at Clara. "You could save others from what you endured." "She's with child," Elias said immediately. "I won't have her put in danger. I'm not asking her to fight." "Mrs. Morrison replied calmly. "Just to help identify victims, provide testimony, perhaps write letters to lawmakers. The territorial government is finally willing to act, but they need evidence, witnesses, women willing to speak truth." Clara felt something stir in her chest. Not the baby, but something fiercer. Purpose. Maybe. What would you need me to do? They talked until full dark. Mrs. Morrison outlining the scope of the trafficking networks, the legal efforts to stop them, the safe houses being established for rescued women. By the time she left, promising to return in a month. Clara's mind was spinning with possibilities. You don't have to do this, Elias said as they prepared for bed. We've got enough to worry on with the baby coming. That's exactly why I have to do it. Clara replied, What if it's a daughter we're having? What kind of world do I want her to grow up in? One where women can be bought and sold, or one where we fought to make it better? He pulled her close, hands playing protective over her rounded belly. Have I told you lately that you're the strongest woman I know? Tell me again, she said. And he did, with words and kisses and reverent touches that made her feel powerful and cherished all at once. The attack came 3 weeks later, on a night when rain lashed the mountains and turned the trails to mud. Clara woke to the sound of breaking glass, Elias already moving, pushing her toward the root cellar they'd reinforced for just this purpose. Stay down, he commanded, grabbing weapons, no matter what you hear. But Clara had learned too well that staying hidden meant staying helpless. She waited until he'd gone out the back, then grabbed the shotgun and crept to the window. 4 men this time, trying to surround the cabin. She recognized one, Jake Fowler, the man from town who'd accosted her. So he'd thrown in with Hutchins' crowd after all. They moved confident despite the rain, sure of their numbers. They hadn't counted on Clara. She fired through the broken window, catching one man in the shoulder, sending him spinning into the mud. The others dove for cover, cursing. She heard Elias's rifle crack from the barn. Another man crying out, Give us the woman, Thornton! Fowler shouted. She's got a price on her head now. Seems Mrs. High and Mighty Morrison values her testimony. Hand her over and we'll let you live. Go to hell, Elias called back, punctuating it with another shot. Clara reloaded with steady hands, her pregnant belly making it awkward to maneuver. But she'd practiced this, prepared for it. When Fowler tried to rush the door, she was ready. The shotgun boomed, and he went down screaming. Clutching his leg, the remaining attackers broke, fleeing into the storm rather than face the crossfire. Clara stayed at her post until Elias came back, soaked and bleeding from a graze across his temple but whole. They held each other in the doorway, rain washing the blood and fear away. So much for staying in the cellar, he said against her hair. You know me better than that. I do. He pulled back to look at her, pride and terror warring in his eyes. God help me, I do. They bound Fowler's leg, just enough to keep him from bleeding out before the sheriff could collect him. The man cursed and threatened until Elias shut him up with a look that promised worse than death if he kept talking. Dawn brought unexpected visitors. Mrs. Morrison with a federal marshal and 3 deputies. They'd been tracking Fowler's gang, following them right to the cabin. Seems we owe you thanks again, the marshal said, surveying the damage. These men were wanted in 4 territories. There's a reward, if you're interested. Clara looked at Elias, saw her own thoughts reflected in his eyes. Give it to Mrs. Morrison's organization, for the safe houses. Mrs. Morrison smiled, the first genuine warmth Clara had seen from her. You're sure? It's a substantial sum. We've got everything we need, Clara said, hand on her belly. Help others find the same. As summer gave way to autumn, their life settled into new rhythms. Clara worked with Mrs. Morrison, writing letters, meeting with lawmakers who came to hear her testimony. 3 more trafficking rings were broken up, dozens of women freed. Each victory felt personal, each rescued girl a small redemption for what she'd endured. Elias supported her work even as he fussed over her advancing pregnancy. He built a cradle with infinite care, sanding it smooth as silk. The cabin grew with additions, a separate bedroom, a proper pantry, plans for a schoolroom because our children will know their letters. By God. Children. Plural. The thought made Clara smile as she folded tiny clothes Martha Garrett had helped her sew. Their child would not grow up alone as she had. There would be brothers and sisters, cousins from the Valley families, a community that had embraced them despite their rough beginning. One night, as the first snow began to fall and Clara's time drew near, they sat by the fire planning for spring. The ranch was thriving, their reputation solid, their future bright as the flames dancing in the hearth. "Are you happy?" Elias asked suddenly. "Truly. This isn't the life you might have had if—" She silenced him with a kiss. "This is exactly the life I want. The only life. With you." He cradled her face in his hands, thumbs tracing her cheekbones with infinite tenderness. "You saved me, Clara. Gave me reason to keep breathing." "We saved each other," she corrected. "And now we get to build something new." Outside, the snow fell soft and silent, blanketing the world in pristine white. But inside, warmed by fire and love and the promise of new life, Clara and Elias held each other and dreamed of all the seasons yet to come. They'd been tested by violence and loss, strengthened by survival and choice. Now they would be renewed by the child growing between them, proof that even in the harshest ground, love could take root and flourish. The future stretched before them, no longer empty but full of possibility, and they would meet it together, come what may. The baby came with the first real blizzard of winter, as if she'd been waiting for the world to turn wild and white before making her entrance. Clara's pain started at dawn, sharp and sudden, pulling her from sleep with a gasp that had Elias on his feet before his eyes were fully open. "Is it time?" he asked, face pale in the gray morning light. "I think—" Clara doubled over as another pain rolled through her, stronger than the first. "Yes. Oh, God, yes." Elias moved with the controlled panic of a man who'd been preparing for this moment while dreading it in equal measure. He'd already sent word to Martha Garrett the week before when Clara's back had been aching fierce, and the older woman had promised to come at first sign, but looking out the window at the wall of white, the snow falling so thick you couldn't see 10 feet, his heart sank. "The storm," he said. "Martha won't be able to make it up the mountain in this—" Clara gripped the bedpost, breathing through another wave of pain. When it passed, she found him watching her with terror written plain across his face. "Then you'll have to do it," she said. "Clara, I've birthed calves and foals, but this is different. You're different. What if—" "Stop." She caught his hand, squeezing hard. "You've read every birthing guide Martha brought. You've got clean water, clean cloth, steady hands, and I trust you. We can do this." He kissed her forehead, his lips trembling slightly. Together, always together. What followed were the longest hours of both their lives. Elias built the fire high, boiled water, laid out everything Martha had said they'd need. Clara walked when she could, leaned on him when the pains grew too strong, cursed with creativity that would have made a sailor blush when they peaked. "Where did you learn language like that?" Elias asked, trying to distract her as she gripped his hands hard enough to leave bruises. "You'd be surprised what you hear at an auction house," she panted. "Also, I may have picked up a few things from you when you're working with the horses." Outside, the storm raged like a living thing, wind howling around the cabin corners, snow piling against the windows, but inside, there was only Clara's laboring breath, Elias's quiet encouragements, and the ancient rhythm of bringing life into the world. The sun was setting, though you couldn't tell through the storm, when Clara felt the overwhelming urge to push. Elias positioned himself as Martha had instructed, his face set with determination despite the tremor in his hands. "I can see the head," he said, voice full of wonder, full of dark hair, just like yours. "You're doing perfect. Love, just a little more." Clara bore down with everything she had, a sound tearing from her throat that was part scream, part war cry. She felt the baby slide free in a rush of fluid and relief, and then silence. Why isn't she crying? Clara tried to sit up, panic flooding through her. "Elias, why?" But he was already working, clearing the baby's mouth and nose with practiced efficiency. A moment later, A thin wail pierced the air, the most beautiful sound Clara had ever heard. Elias's face broke into a grin so wide it looked like it might crack him open. "She's perfect," he said, voice thick with emotion. "Clara, she's absolutely perfect." He laid the baby on Clara's chest, this tiny, squalling creature with a red face and failing fists. Clara touched her daughter's head with trembling fingers, counting toes and fingers, marveling at the wholeness of her. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "Oh, hello. We've been waiting for you." Elias cut the cord with hands that shook only slightly, wrapped the baby in the soft blanket Clara had sewn months ago. He tended to Clara with gentle efficiency, cleaning her up, helping her deliver the afterbirth, making sure the bleeding was normal. All the while, he kept looking at their daughter like she might disappear if he glanced away. "What should we call her?" Clara asked as she nursed the baby for the first time, instinct guiding them both. Elias sat on the bed beside them, one arm around Clara, one finger stroking the baby's impossibly soft cheek. "I was thinking, if it's all right, maybe Hope, because that's what she is. Hope that life goes on, hope that there's good still to come." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "Hope Rose Thornton, for the future and the past. Hope Rose," he repeated, testing the weight of it. "It's perfect." The storm blew itself out during the night, leaving the world transformed under feet of pristine snow. Clara dozed between feedings, Elias keeping watch like a guardian angel. He'd moved his chair close to the bed, couldn't seem to stop touching them both. Clara's hair, Hopi's tiny fist, as if reassuring himself they were real. When Clara woke to find him crying silently in the pre-dawn darkness, she reached for his hand. "What's wrong?" she asked softly, not wanting to wake Hope. "Nothing's wrong," he said, wiping his face. "Everything's right. That's what... I never thought I'd have this again. A family. A reason to greet the morning. I thought that part of my life was buried up on that hillside." Clara tugged him onto the bed, making room for him to stretch out beside them. Hope lay between them, making soft snuffling sounds in her sleep. "Life doesn't end with loss," Clara said. "It just changes direction, like a creek finding its way around stones." He kissed her temple, then bent to kiss Hope's head with infinite gentleness. "Wise woman, my wife." "I had a good teacher," she said, and felt him smile against her skin. Martha Garrett made it up the mountain 2 days later, her husband Ben breaking trail with their big draft horses. She burst through the door in a flurry of snow and concern, only to stop short at the sight of Clara sitting up in bed, nursing Hope while Elias read aloud from one of his books. "Well," Martha said, hands on her hips, "seems you managed just fine without me." "Elias was wonderful," Clara said, smiling at her husband's blush. "Best midwife in the territory." Martha examined them both with expert hands, pronouncing mother and baby healthy as horses. She cooed over Hope, who gazed back with the unfocused intensity of the very new. "She's got your stubbornness already," Martha told Clara. "I can see it in that chin. Lord help you when she's older." They stayed for supper, Ben and Elias talking about spring plans, while Martha helped Clara with the mysteries of new motherhood. When they left, the cabin felt quieter but not empty. Hope filled the space with her presence, tiny as she was. The weeks that followed blurred together in a haze of feedings and diapers, sleepless nights and quiet miracles. Hope grew round and rosy, her dark hair coming in thick, her gray eyes so like Clara's, tracking movement with increasing interest. Elias was besotted, carrying her around the cabin while he did chores, talking to her about everything and nothing. "See that?" he'd say, showing her the view from the window. "That's where we'll teach you to ride. And there, that's where your mama and I got married, proper-like, just as soon as the preacher can make it up here." Clara would watch them together, her heart so full it ached. Seeing this strong, scarred man go soft over their daughter healed something in her she hadn't known was broken. One afternoon, as spring began to whisper through the valleys, Clara was hanging laundry when she heard horses approaching. Her hand went automatically to the rifle by the door, But then she recognized the riders. Mrs. Morrison, accompanied by a man in a federal marshal's uniform. Mrs. Thornton. Mrs. Morrison called out. "I hope we're not intruding. We have news." They gathered in the cabin. Hope sleeping in her cradle by the fire. Mrs. Morrison's usual stern expression had softened into something almost like satisfaction. "We've done it," she announced. "The territorial legislature has passed the strongest anti-trafficking laws in the nation. Women can no longer be sold at auction, period. And there are real penalties now for those who try." Clara sank into a chair, overwhelmed. "It's over. The legal trade is over," the marshal corrected. "There will always be those who operate in shadows. But yes, what happened to you can't happen legally to another woman in this territory. Your testimony was crucial." Mrs. Morrison added. "Your willingness to speak truth, to name names, to describe the reality of it. You saved lives, Mrs. Thornton, more than you'll ever know." After they left, with promises to stay in touch and offers of continued support, Clara found herself standing over Hope's cradle. Her daughter slept peacefully. Tiny fist curled against her cheek, unaware of the battles fought to make her world safer. "You'll never know that fear," Clara whispered. "Never be property. Never have your worth measured in dollars. That's my promise to you." Elias came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "Our promise," he corrected. "We've got a lot of promises to keep to this little one." As winter gave way fully to spring, their life found new rhythms. Hope grew fat and happy, beginning to smile, then laugh, a sound that never failed to stop both parents in their tracks. The ranch prospered, their reputation as honest dealers spreading. Neighbors came to trade horses, seek Elias's advice on bloodlines, admire the baby who'd become the unofficial darling of the valley. Clara returned to her work with Mrs. Morrison, though differently now, with hope in a sling across her chest. She visited the safe houses, talked to rescued women, helped them write letters home or find work that didn't involve selling themselves. Some of them held Hope with wondering hands, as if she were proof that life could bloom even after the harshest seasons. One day, as Clara was teaching a girl barely 16 how to write her letters, the girl asked, "How did you do it? How did you go from that to this?" She gestured at Hope, at Clara's clean dress, at the obvious love in Elias's eyes when he looked at his family. Clara thought about it, rocking Hope gently. "I survived," she said finally. "And then I chose to do more than survive. I chose to trust, to love, to fight for better. It wasn't easy. Some days it still isn't. But every choice led to the next, and here we are." "Do you ever regret it? Coming west? Everything that happened?" It was a question Clara had asked herself in the darkest moments. But looking at her daughter's face, thinking of Elias's smile, the answer came clear. How can I regret the path that led me here? Yes, there was pain, loss, fear, but also love and purpose, and this little one. I wouldn't change a step of it if it meant losing what I've found. That evening, as she related the conversation to Elias, he set down the harness he was mending to look at her fully. "Do you mean that? About not changing anything?" Clara shifted Hope to her other arm, considering. "My parents died. I was sold like cattle. Those things will always be true, always hurt. But if they hadn't happened, I wouldn't have found you. We wouldn't have Hope. The scared girl at that auction wouldn't have believed she could be this happy. But here we are." He crossed to her, framing her face with gentle hands. "Here we are," he agreed, and kissed her with all the tenderness in his wounded heart. That night, after Hope was settled in her cradle and the cabin was quiet, Clara stood at the window watching stars appear over the mountains. In a few weeks, the circuit preacher would come through and they'd be married proper. Though she already felt more married than any ceremony could make them. Their daughter would grow up free and fierce in these hills. There would be more children. God willing, she could already imagine Hope as a big sister, protective and bossy. The future stretched before them, not without challenges. There would always be storms. always be those who wished harm, but bright with possibility. They'd built something from ashes and auction blocks, from grief and desperate chances. Love had grown in the rockiest soil, stubborn as sagebrush, deep-rooted as the ancient pines. Elias joined her at the window, pulling her back against his chest. Together they watched the night deepen, listened to their daughter's soft breathing, felt the pulse of life all around them. Two broken souls no longer broken, but whole in ways they'd never dared dream. "Thank you," Elias murmured against her hair. "For what?" "For not giving up, for fighting, for choosing us even when it would have been easier to run." Clara turned in his arms, reaching up to trace the lines that pain and laughter had carved in his face. "Thank you for being worth fighting for seeing me as more than damaged goods, for giving me a home." "We gave each other a home," he said, echoing words from months before. "And now we've made it a family." They stood there as the moon rose full and bright, illuminating the land they'd claimed through blood and tears and fierce determination. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Hope would wake hungry. Chores would need doing. Life would demand its due. But tonight, in this moment, they had everything. A man who'd thought love had died with his first family. A woman who'd been sold to the highest bidder. A baby who would never know that particular degradation. Together, they were proof that even the harshest winter gives way to spring, that love could bloom in the most unlikely ground. The mountains stood eternal witness to their small human drama, and the stars wheeled overhead, indifferent and beautiful. But in the cabin beneath them, 3 hearts beat in harmony, and that was miracle enough for any lifetime. Spring arrived in earnest, melting the last stubborn patches of snow and turning the mountain trails to mud. Hope was 3 months old now, plump and bright-eyed, given to long conversations and baby babble that Elias swore made perfect sense. Clara had recovered fully from the birth, her body strong again from the constant work of frontier life, though softer now in ways that made Elias's eyes darken with appreciation. It was time to leave. "Just for a few weeks," Clara said for the 1000th time, packing their few belongings into saddlebags. "We need supplies we can't get in Dustwater, and I want Hope to see something beyond these mountains." Elias nodded, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. Leaving the safety of their valley felt like tempting fate, but they'd received word that the railroad had reached Carson City, bringing with it goods and opportunities that couldn't be ignored. More importantly, Clara had business with Mrs. Morrison about expanding the safe houses. They made quite a procession heading down the mountain. Elias on his paint horse, Clara on the gentle mare he'd trained specially for her, Hope secure in a sling across Clara's chest. 2 pack horses carried their supplies and the furs Elias had trapped over winter to trade. The first night, they camped by a stream swollen with snowmelt. Hope fussed at the change in routine until Clara sang the lullabies her mother had once sung to her. Elias built their fire in a protective circle of stones, ever watchful of the shadows beyond. "I used to dream of traveling," Clara said, settling Hope for the night. "Mama and Papa talked about seeing the Pacific Ocean, about cities with gas lights and theaters. I never imagined I'd be doing it like this." "Disappointed?" Elias asked, though his smile said he knew better. "No." She looked around their simple camp, the horses grazing nearby, their baby sleeping peaceful between them, her husband's strong presence beside her. "This is better than any dream. It's real." They reached Carson City after 4 days of steady travel. The town had exploded since the railroad arrived. What had been a frontier settlement was now a proper city, with brick buildings, wooden sidewalks, and more people than Clara had seen since leaving Ohio. Hope's eyes went wide at all the activity, and she gripped Clara's dress with tiny fists as they navigated the crowded streets. Elias kept close, his hand never far from his pistol, old habits dying hard. They took rooms at a respectable boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Dalton, who cooed over Hope and didn't ask questions about their lack of wedding rings. That first night in a real bed with clean sheets felt like untold luxury. The next days passed in a whirl of activity. Clara met with Mrs. Morrison and a group of reform-minded women who were working to establish proper schools and orphanages. They welcomed her insights about education for rescued women, taking notes as she described the programs that had worked best. "You have a gift for this, Mrs. Morrison observed after one particularly productive meeting. "Have you considered staying in the city? There's so much work to be done, and with your experience." Clara glanced out the window to where Elias was teaching Hope to wave at the horses in the street. "My place is with my family, but I can help from anywhere. Maybe we can set up a network, letters and visits, spreading what works to all the territories." Meanwhile, Elias found his own purpose in the city. His skill with horses drew attention from the army quartermaster, who was desperate for someone who could evaluate the mounts being shipped west. Within days, Elias had a standing offer to supply trained horses to the cavalry posts. "It's honest work," he told Clara that evening as they walked along the Carson River, Hope babbling at the ducks from her sling. "Good money, too. We could build that bigger house you've been sketching." But even as opportunities opened before them, both felt the pull of their mountain valley. The city was exciting but exhausting, full of noise and strangers and too many memories of other cities. Other times, when Hope developed a cough from the coal smoke and dust, they decided it was time to go home. Their last stop was the territorial courthouse. "We can't leave without making it official," Clara insisted. They'd been trying to get the circuit preacher to their cabin for months with no luck. Here was their chance. The ceremony was simple, just them, Hope, and 2 witnesses pulled from the clerk's office. But when the judge pronounced them husband and wife, Clara saw tears in Elias's eyes. "Now no one can question it," he said fiercely. "You're mine and I'm yours, legal and binding." "I was always yours," Clara replied. "From that first night when you gave me your bed and slept in the cold. This just makes it official for everyone else." They left Carson City with full packs and fuller hearts. The return journey felt like coming home with each mile that passed. Hope seemed to sense it too, settling into sleep more easily under the familiar stars. On their last night before reaching the cabin, camped in a meadow bright with wildflowers, Elias surprised Clara with a gift. From his saddlebag, he pulled out a small leather journal and a set of steel-nibbed pens. "For your letters," he explained, "and maybe for writing down your story, what you've been through, what you've learned. Might help others to read it someday." Clara turned the journal over in her hands, running her fingers across the smooth leather cover. "My story. Our story," he corrected. "All of it. The ugly parts and the beautiful ones. Hope should know where she came from, what her parents survived to give her this life." That night, by firelight with Hope nursing contentedly, Clara wrote her first entry. She started with the day her parents died, writing with unflinching honesty about the fear, the grief, the moment Hutchins had found her. She wrote about the auction, the humiliation of being displayed and rejected, and then she wrote about Elias, about that first ride through the darkness to an unknown future. The words poured out of her, years of silence breaking like a dam. Elias listened as she read some passages aloud, holding her when the memories grew too heavy. By dawn, she had filled a dozen pages and felt lighter somehow, as if committing the past to paper had robbed it of some power. They reached home as the sun touched the mountain peaks. The cabin stood solid and welcoming, the new barn sturdy beside it. The horses in the pasture whinnied greeting. Everything was as they'd left it, yet somehow looked different, smaller perhaps, but dearer too. Home, Clara breathed, and felt the truth of it in her bones. They settled back into routine with grateful hearts. The garden needed planting, the horses needed working. Hope needed the 1,000 small tendernesses that made up a baby's day. But now there were new elements. Clara's journal growing page by page, letters arriving from the network of women she'd helped establish, plans taking shape for the future. One evening in late spring, as Clara worked in the garden with Hope playing on a blanket beside her, she heard horses approaching. Her hand went to the rifle old habits, but relaxed when she recognized Ben and Martha Garrett, accompanied by a young woman she didn't know. "Clara," Martha called out, "we've brought you a visitor." The young woman dismounted carefully, and Clara saw she was heavily pregnant. She was perhaps 18, with the worn look of someone who'd traveled hard roads, but her eyes held determination rather than defeat. "Mrs. Thornton?" she asked. "I'm Sarah Walsh, Mrs. Morrison sent me. Said you might have work for someone willing to earn her keep." Clara looked to Elias, who'd emerged from the barn. He studied the girl with that careful way of his, then nodded slightly. "We can always use help," Clara said warmly, "especially with Hope getting more active every day. Come inside. You look tired. When are you due?" 2 months, near as I can figure." Sarah's hand went protective to her belly. "I know it's a lot to ask, taking in a woman in my condition, but I've got nowhere else, and Mrs. Morrison said you understood about starting over." Over dinner, Sarah's story emerged in pieces. A factory girl from back east, seduced by promises of marriage, abandoned when her condition became known. She'd come west, hoping for anonymity and work, only to find both scarce for a woman alone. The safe houses had taken her in, and now here she was. "I can cook, clean, sew," Sarah said earnestly. "I'm not afraid of hard work, and I'm good with babies, helped raise my younger siblings before the factory." "You'll stay," Clara decided. "We've got the room, and Lord knows I could use help with Hope. Elias has been talking about building an addition anyway." And so their family grew. Sarah proved as good as her word. Hard-working, quiet, grateful for the chance. She took to Hope immediately, and the baby responded with delighted giggles, watching her with the child. Clara remembered her own desperation not so long ago. As summer deepened, their small household found its rhythm. Sarah helped with the endless chores, while Clara split her time between Hope, the garden, and her writing. Elias worked with the horses and started the addition that would give Sarah her own space. In the evenings, they gathered around the fire, Clara writing or reading aloud, Sarah sewing tiny clothes for her coming child, Elias carving toys for Hope, who was trying desperately to crawl. "Is it strange?" Sarah asked one night. "Taking in someone like me, after what you went through?" Clara considered the question. "Maybe it should be, but I think this is how we change things. Not just with laws and grand gestures, but one woman at a time, one chance at a time. Like Mr. Thornton gave you a chance. Exactly like that." Clara smiled at her husband, who was letting Hope grip his fingers as she pulled herself to standing. "Sometimes salvation comes in unexpected packages." Sarah's baby arrived on a night when summer lightning danced across the peaks. This time, Martha Garrett was there to help, though Clara assisted with steady hands that remembered her own labor. The baby was a boy, small but strong, with lungs that announced his arrival to the whole valley. "What will you name him?" Clara asked as Sarah held her son for the first time. "Thomas," Sarah said softly. "After my father, Thomas Thornton Walsh. If that's all right, I want him to carry the name of the people who gave us a home." Elias had to step outside at that, and Clara found him later standing by Mabel and Rose's graves, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. She wrapped her arms around him from behind, holding tight. "They would be proud," she whispered, "of what you've built from the ashes, of the home you've made for the lost." "We've made," he corrected, turning to hold her. "None of this happens without you." As autumn approached, their expanded household hummed with life. Hope had mastered crawling and was pulling herself up on everything, babbling constantly in what Elias insisted was perfectly logical conversation. Baby Thomas thrived under the care of his mother and extended family. Sarah bloomed with renewed purpose, taking on more responsibilities and even helping Clara with her correspondence. The journal had grown to several volumes now. Clara wrote in it daily, observations about the children, memories of her parents, accounts of the women who passed through seeking help or hope. She wrote about the small triumphs and the hard days, about building a life from broken pieces. One evening, as the first frost touched the valley, a letter arrived that would change their course again. Mrs. Morrison wrote of new legislation being proposed at the federal level, of meetings in Washington where Clara's testimony could make a difference. "It's a long journey," Clara said, reading the letter aloud. "Weeks away from home, but if it helps protect other women, then we go," Elias said simply. "All of us. Sarah can manage Hope and Thomas on the train. We'll see this country you've been writing about." Clara looked around their cabin, at Sarah nursing Thomas by the fire, at Hope determinedly trying to walk between chairs, at Elias already planning the journey with that careful way of his. This was not the life she'd imagined as a girl in Ohio, dreaming of adventure. It was harder and stranger and more wonderful than any dream. "Yes," she said, "we'll go. We'll tell our story to anyone who'll listen. And then we'll come home." That night, she wrote in her journal, "Tomorrow we begin preparing for a journey that would have terrified the girl who stood on that auction platform 2 years ago. But I am not that girl anymore. I am a wife, a mother, a woman who has learned that strength comes not from being unbroken, but from choosing to build something beautiful from the pieces. We will carry our story east, Hope and Thomas and all of us, proof that even the darkest chapters can lead to light." Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall, gentle as a blessing, in the warmth of their cabin, surrounded by chosen family. Clara closed her journal and reached for her daughter. Hope gripped her fingers with fierce baby strength, dark eyes bright with curiosity about the world she'd inherit. A better world, Clara promised silently. One where girls like Sarah had choices, where women weren't property, where love could grow even in the rockiest soil. It would take work, constant and sometimes thankless. But looking at the faces around her fire, Elias, steady as the mountains, Sarah, proof that second chances existed, the babies, innocent of the battles being fought for their futures. Clara knew they were up to the task. They'd already survived the worst. Now it was time to build something lasting from the ashes of what they'd endured. Together, always together, they would write the next chapter of their story. 1 year later, Clara stood in the doorway of their expanded cabin, watching spring paint the valley in shades of green and gold. Hope toddled through the garden on sturdy legs, chasing butterflies with determined concentration. Thomas crawled behind her, trying desperately to keep up with his adopted sister. Sarah hung laundry on the line, humming a melody that drifted across the yard like birdsong. The trip to Washington had been a success beyond their wildest hopes. Clara's testimony before Congress, with hope balanced on her hip, had moved even the most cynical politicians. The image of a young mother who'd been sold at auction, speaking eloquently about the need for federal protection, had appeared in newspapers across the nation. Laws had been strengthened, funding secured for safe houses, and a network established that would help countless women escape the fate Clara had narrowly avoided. But more than that, the journey had shown Clara the breadth of the country they called home, vast plains that rolled like oceans, cities rising from prairie dust, people of every kind seeking their own versions of the American promise. Hope had taken her first steps in a hotel in Chicago. Thomas had been baptized in a church in St. Louis. Sarah had discovered she had a gift for organization, keeping their traveling household running smooth as clockwork. Now they were home, and life had settled into new patterns. The cabin had grown to accommodate their expanding family. A proper kitchen, separate bedrooms, even a small room Clara used as a study for her writing. Her journal had become something more, shaped into a book that Mrs. Morrison was helping to publish. "Mail's coming," Elias called from the barn, pointing to the dust cloud that marked the monthly rider's approach. Clara wiped her hands on her apron and went to meet him. The mail rider, young Jack Peterson, always had a smile for her and candy for the children. "Got a heavy load for you today, Mrs. Thornton," he said, hauling a canvas sack from his saddlebags. "Seems like half the country's writing to you." It was only a slight exaggeration. Since the newspaper articles, letters had poured in, from women seeking help, from reformers wanting advice, from girls who'd read her story and found hope. Clara spent hours each week responding, Sarah helping with the correspondence. Among the usual letters was a package wrapped in brown paper. Clara's breath caught when she saw the return address. Ohio, from a law firm in her hometown. "What is it?" Elias asked, coming up beside her, with trembling fingers. Clara opened the package. Inside was a smaller parcel wrapped in faded fabric, her mother's shawl. She realized with a shock, and a letter from a lawyer. "Dear Mrs. Thornton," she read aloud, "I represent the estate of Samuel Hutchins, deceased, in reviewing his belongings. We discovered items that appear to have belonged to your late parents, Jonathan and Mary Stewart. Mr. Hutchins kept meticulous records, and these were labeled with your name. We are returning them to their rightful owner, along with our apologies for any distress Mr. Hutchins may have caused you." Inside the shawl were her mother's silver locket, her father's watch, and the small leather Bible they'd carried from Ohio. Clara sank onto the porch step, clutching the treasures she'd thought lost forever. "Mama," Hope said, patting Clara's knee with concern. "Mama cry?" Happy tears. Sweet girl. Clara managed, "These belong to your grandparents. Now they're yours and Thomas's, to remember where we came from." That evening, as they gathered for supper, Clara wore her mother's locket. It caught the lamplight as she moved, a piece of the past reclaimed and transformed. Sarah had made a special meal to celebrate, and even little Thomas seemed to sense the importance of the moment, babbling happily from his high chair. "I've been thinking," Elias said as they finished eating. "The children are going to need proper schooling soon, and we're not the only family in these parts with young ones. What if we built a schoolhouse, brought in a teacher?" Clara's eyes lit up. "We could use part of the money from the horse contracts. Make it a real school, open to everyone, the ranch children, the town children, even the Indian children from the reservation." "An integrated school?" Sarah asked, surprised. "That's ambitious. Everything worth doing is—" Clara replied, "We've already broken so many barriers. Why not one more?" Plans began that very night, sketched out on the rough table while the children played at their feet. By summer, the schoolhouse was rising on a piece of land donated by the Garretts, centrally located for all the valley families. Clara threw herself into the project with the same determination she'd brought to everything else, writing to teaching colleges, ordering books and supplies, convincing skeptical neighbors. The teacher they hired was a surprise to everyone, a young black woman named Ruth Harper, freshly graduated from Oberlin College, full of fire and ideas about education. She arrived on the stage in August, took one look at the half-built schoolhouse and the assembled children of various colors, and declared it the opportunity she'd been praying for. "You sure about this?" Ben Garrett asked Elias quietly at the school raising. "Folks might talk. Let them talk," Elias replied, steadying a beam while neighbors hammered it into place. "My daughter's going to grow up in a different world than we did. Ben, better we start building it now." The school opened in September, with 12 students ranging from age 5 to 15. Hope was the youngest, barely 3, but determined not to be left out. She sat in the front row clutching her slate, copying letters with fierce concentration while the older children worked on their sums. Clara often volunteered at the school, teaching the older girls to write proper letters and keep accounts. She watched with satisfaction as children who might never have met otherwise became friends over shared lessons and playground games. The future was being written in that little schoolhouse, one multiplication table at a time. Autumn brought unexpected visitors. A wagon rolled up to the cabin one afternoon, and Clara was shocked to see 3 women climb down. Women she recognized from the auction house in Dustwater, fellow captives in those terrible days. "Clara, one of them, a widow named Helen, asked hesitantly, "That is, Mrs. Thornton? We heard, that is, we read about you in the papers, about what you've done." "Helen!" Clara embraced the woman, tears starting. "And Margaret, and Jane. Come in, please. You must be exhausted." Over tea and Sarah's fresh bread, their stories emerged. Helen had been bought by a farmer who'd turned out to be kind. If distant, they'd built a companionable marriage. And she now had 2 sons. Margaret had escaped her buyer after a week, making her way to California where she worked in a boarding house. Jane's story was harder years of servitude before Mrs. Morrison's network had found and freed her. "We wanted to see you," Jane said quietly, "to see if it was true. If someone who'd stood on that platform could really have all this." She gestured at the comfortable room, the children playing, the obvious love between Clara and Elias. "It's true," Clara said. "Every word. It wasn't easy, and there were times I thought I'd die from the pain of it. But it's possible. Life after the auction is possible." They stayed for 3 days, healing happening in quiet conversations and shared meals. When they left, each carried letters of introduction to Mrs. Morrison's network, plans for their own futures, and the knowledge that they weren't alone. Winter came gentle that year, with steady snow that blanketed the valley in pristine white. The schoolhouse continued despite the weather. Ruth Harper proving as hardy as any mountain woman. She boarded with different families each week, bringing news and books and a breath of the wider world. On Christmas Eve, their cabin overflowed with guests, the Garretts, Ruth Harper, several of the ranch families, and a surprise visitor, Mrs. Morrison herself, come to see the fruits of their shared labor. "I hardly recognize you," she told Clara as they watched the children perform a nativity play Sarah had organized. "That frightened girl from the auction seems like a different person entirely." "She was," Clara replied, "but she's still part of me. I carry her, and all the others who didn't get the chances I did. That's why the work matters." After the guests left and the children were abed, Clara and Elias sat by the fire, sharing a quiet moment in the chaos of their full life. He was carving a rocking horse for Thomas while she worked on correspondence. "Any regrets?" he asked, echoing a question from years before. Clara set down her pen, considering. "How could I regret anything that brought us here? Look what we've built. Elias, not just the buildings or the school or even the laws. We've built a family from ashes. We've made a place where broken people can heal." He set aside his carving to pull her into his lap, holding her close. "You healed me," he murmured against her hair. "Gave me reason to keep breathing when I thought I had none." "We healed each other," she corrected. "And now we get to pass that on." They made love by the dying fire, slow and sweet, a renewal of all the promises they'd made and kept. Outside, snow fell soft as whispers, blanketing their valley in peace. Spring arrived with a letter that would change everything once again. Clara's book was to be published, with the introduction by Frederick Douglass himself. Publishers in New York wanted her to come for a book tour, to speak at colleges and churches about her experiences. "It's a wonderful opportunity," Sarah said, bouncing Thomas on her knee. "Think of all the people you could reach." Clara looked around their kitchen, at Hope practicing her letters at the table, at Elias mending harness by the window, at this life they'd built with such care. "I don't know if I want to leave, even for a few weeks. We've traveled enough." "Then don't." Elias said simply, "Let them come to you if they want to hear your story. This is your place, our place." In the end, they compromised. Clara would travel to a few major cities, but always with family. Hope and Thomas would see the Atlantic Ocean their grandparents had crossed. Sarah would assist with the tour, finding she had a talent for managing logistics, and Elias would be there, steady as always, making sure his family stayed grounded no matter how far they flew. The night before they left, Clara climbed the hill to the graves. Mabel and Rose's markers stood weathered but maintained, wildflowers blooming around them. She knelt between them and her parents' memorial stone, placed there even though their bodies lay elsewhere. "We're taking good care of him," she whispered to Mabel's grave. "And he's taking care of us. Your daughter has a sister now, and a brother." The house rings with children's laughter again. "I hope that brings you peace." To her parents, she said, "I'm going to tell your story too. How you dreamed of better things, how you died trying to build them. Your granddaughter will know your names, your hopes, The journey continues. When she returned to the cabin, she found Elias on the porch, Hope sleeping in his arms. He'd been telling her stories about the stars, their favorite evening ritual. "Ready for another adventure?" he asked. Clara sat beside him, leaning into his warmth. "With you, always." They sat in comfortable silence, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new stages to stand on, new audiences to reach. But tonight, they were simply a family at home, held safe by the mountains and each other. The book tour was a triumph. Clara spoke to packed halls from Denver to Boston, her simple eloquence and Hope's presence moving audiences to tears and action. Money poured in for safe houses and schools. Laws were strengthened in state after state. The girl who'd been sold for $5 silver became a voice for the voiceless, a hope for the hopeless. But the greatest triumph was always the return home, the moment when their wagon crested the ridge and the valley spread before them, the cabin with smoke rising from the chimney, the schoolhouse with children playing in the yard, the mountains standing eternal guard. Hope would squeal with delight, Thomas would clap his hands, and Sarah would sigh with relief. "Home," Ellis would say, and Clara would echo him, feeling the truth of it bone deep. One evening that summer, as Clara worked in her study on a new book, this one about building communities of healing, Hope burst in with a handful of wildflowers. "For you, Mama," she announced. "Miss Ruth says they're for celebrating." "Celebrating what, sweetheart?" "Just everything," Hope said with 3-year-old wisdom, then ran off to find more adventures. Clara tucked a flower behind her ear and returned to her writing. The words flowed easier now. The story no longer just hers, but belonging to all the women who'd found strength in shared struggle. Outside her window, she could see Elias teaching Thomas to ride a gentle old mare, both of them laughing as the boy gripped the saddle horn with determined hands. This was what victory looked like. Not grand gestures or famous names, but daily choices to build rather than break, to heal rather than wound, to open doors rather than close them. The auction platform seemed a lifetime away, yet its shadow had shaped everything that followed. Clara dipped her pen and continued writing. To every woman who has been told she is property, who has been valued only in coins, who has believed herself worthless, know this: your worth is not determined by those who would buy or sell you. You carry within yourself the power to rise, to choose, to build a life of meaning from the ashes of what was taken. It will not be easy. The scars remain even as new skin grows, but it is possible. We are the proof. We who have walked through fire and emerged not unburned, but forged into something stronger. The sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. In the kitchen, Sarah called everyone for supper. Hope's laughter rang out as Elias swung her up onto his shoulders. Thomas babbled excitedly about his horse ride, the ordinary sounds of family, of home, of life continuing despite all odds. Clara set down her pen and went to join them. Tomorrow she would write more, answer more letters, fight more battles. But tonight, there was bread to break, and stories to share, and children to tuck into bed. Tonight, there was the quiet miracle of survival transformed into thriving. The girl sold at auction was gone, but in her place stood a woman who had learned the fiercest truth of all, that love could grow anywhere, even in the harshest ground, if tended with courage and hope. And from that love, anything, everything, was possible. In the gathering darkness, with her family around the table and mountains standing guard, Clara gave thanks for the journey that had brought them here. Every step, every scar, every tear had led to this moment. She was home. They were whole. And the story, their story, would continue as long as there were stars to steer by and love to light the way. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I hope Clara and Elias's journey touched your heart as much as it touched mine while sharing it. If you're listening to this tale of love and redemption from the American frontier, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from. Please leave a comment below sharing your location and your thoughts about the story. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel for more authentic stories from America's untamed past. And share what moments resonated most with you. Your engagement helps us bring more of these powerful historical narratives to life. Until next time, partners.